Why is usury wrong? A Thomistic analysis by Eric Diamond. It slayeth the child in the womb, it stayeth the young man's courting, it hath brought palsy to bed, and lieth between the young bride and her bridegroom, contra naturam. This, of course, is the sin of usury, as described by one of the great American poets of the 20th century, Ezra Pound. For Pound, the precarious and immoral state of modern life was in large part due to the West's abandonment of the traditional prohibition on usury in the early days of the Renaissance. Pound traces everything from the decay of aesthetic standards to declining birth rates back to this pivotal moment in Western intellectual history. For example, earlier on in the poem, Pound observes that, with usura, the line grows thick. This somewhat obscure turn of phrase is a reference to the changing dimensions of line in European painting. In one of his many letters on the subject, Pound claimed that he could tell the bank rate and component of tolerance for usury in any epoch by the quality of line. Thus, the thin lines of the Quattrocentro painters were reflective of an ability to make fine moral distinctions between things, but as usury and its sister sin sodomy became more accepted in the High Renaissance and Baroque period, the lines waxed steadily greater, until finally, by the period of the late 19th century, the lines and distinctions between objects are blurred entirely, leaving only the formless and confused compositions of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionist painters, such as those of Claude Monet and Vincent van Gogh. In our own era, which so helplessly struggles to make even the most basic moral distinctions, such as those between male and female, or those between an unborn child and a pile of rocks, the idea that usury is a grave sin seems almost unthinkable. But this was not always the case. The prohibition on usury is in fact a human universal. No civilization prior to our own has ever condoned it. The biggest question is not whether or not usury is a sin, for it is, but why we have so much difficulty seeing it as such, when all of our ancestors and forefathers so reflexively shrunk from it with utter contempt and disgust. This is where we must begin to make thin the line. Here we must go back again and begin with the fine art of making distinctions. And who better to make distinction than the Latin West's preeminent philosopher of nature, St. Thomas Aquinas? It was he who said that, quote, "To take usury for money lent is unjust in itself, not first and foremost because of the moral implications, though those are relevant, but instead because usury is, quote, to sell what does not exist." Here we must begin with a quick definition. After all, what is usury? Many in our own time wish to redefine it as an excessively high rate of interest on a loan, a definition which is not only vague, indefinite, useless, and entirely alien to the pre-modern world, but one which is nowhere to be found in any of the patristic treatises on the subject. The less permissive definition, money lent at compound interest, is itself still insufficient, and in spite of its seeming traditionalism, it is not to be found anywhere in the patristic literature. Here, we will instead use the more exacting, and entirely correct, definition from the Catechism of the Council of Trent, which reads as follows: "Whatever is received above the capital and principal, be it money or anything else that may be purchased or estimated by money, is usury." Thus, if JP Morgan Chase gives me a credit card with 36.5% APR, this is usury. But so too is a VA loan for first-time homebuyers at a mere 1.5% APR, as would also be the asking of the smallest penny of interest above and beyond what is the principal in any loan. The amount and the situational circumstances are only differences in degree, not in kind. Pope Benedict XIV would seem to agree with this. In his 1745 encyclical Vix Pervenit, he notes as follows: "One cannot condone the sin of usury by arguing that the gain is not great or excessive, but rather moderate and small. Neither can it be condoned by arguing that the borrower is rich, nor even by arguing that money borrowed is not left idle, but is spent usefully, either to increase one's fortune, to purchase new estates, or to engage in business transactions." Here, allow me to present a simple set of examples for clarification. Imagine for a moment that my friend David has agreed to lend me his bicycle for a period of 6 months. During this time, I am free to use David's bicycle for its essential purpose, transportation, whilst David still retains his ownership or title of the bicycle. Each month I am to pay David a set fee for the price of the use of the bicycle, which, at the end of the 6-month period, David expects to be returned to him in its original state, barring some reasonable wear and tear. The monthly fee or rent I pay each month is just, given that David, in spite of being the true title owner of the bicycle, has alienated a portion of its use from his person for a set period of time. When I pay my monthly bicycle rent to David, I am paying for the value which he has alienated from himself by allowing me to be the one using the bicycle during this 6-month period. Though we more commonly know these as rentals, in traditional Roman jurisprudence, this is a type of contract known as a commodatum. What is interesting to note here is that currency, as such, cannot be rented. Because currency's value is in its exchange, it is impossible to give partial ownership of the use value of a given unit of currency. For example, while David can give me 6 months' worth of use of the value of his bicycle, a fraction of its total use value over the course of the life of the bike, he cannot give me a portion of the use value of $1 and still retain full title ownership of the dollar as such. If David were to give me 50% of the use value of his dollar, he would in reality be giving me full ownership of 50 cents, and thus would not be renting the money, as in a commodatum. This is why loans of this type typically fall under a different type of contract, known in Roman jurisprudence as a mutuum. We return again to the example of the bicycle. In this new scenario, David lends me his bicycle for the same period of time, but with a few key differences. First, David will give me the title to the bicycle, making me its true legal owner. Second, David will stipulate that I must return to him the bicycle in kind at the end of the 6-month period. In other words, I am free to return to David the same bicycle at the end of the contract, or I am free to return to him a different but equivalent bicycle of the same make and model, with the bicycles here treated as fungible assets. Thus, in a mutuum, there is no expectation or stipulation that I return the originally lent item. I am free to do as I please with it, given that I become its title owner. For example, I can let the bicycle sit in my garage and give it back to David at the end of the loan, as is. Alternatively, I can sell it on Craigslist and use the funds to speculate on cryptocurrencies in hopes of buying a new bicycle back later and pocketing the difference as profit. It is, after all, my bicycle. This would not be possible under a commodatum, as the contract stipulates that I must return the same bicycle to David, which in title has never left his ownership. However, because the mutuum contract transfers the title of the bicycle to me, I would be free to do as I please, so long as I find some way of obtaining a bicycle of equivalent year and make to David by the end of the contract. In a mutuum, we treat the bicycle as an interchangeable asset. In a commodatum, it is the specific bicycle that matters. Now, if you're wondering how this connects to usury, consider the following. Because of the inherent fungibility of money, a loan of currency is almost always a mutuum, as the lender alienates his ownership of the property to the borrower, holding no expectation that the borrower return the exact same gold coins, dollar bills, or silver talents to him. Just as I may return any bicycle of the same make and model to David by the end of my mutuum contract, so too may I return any dollar bill, and not just the specific dollar bills that were given to me, to a hypothetical creditor. In the case of the mutuum loan, if we were to imagine David also asking for an additional monthly rent on the bicycle, the way he did in the commodatum, we would quickly become aware of the absurdity of the request. David would be charging me a rent for a bicycle which he is no longer in possession of, and of which he no longer has a title to. In some instances, such as if I were to melt down the bicycle for scrap, David may be even charging me a rent for a bicycle which no longer exists. This is what usurious transactions are. They are innately unjust, given that they are demands for rents on objects which the lender no longer has legal possession over. Given the fact that he alienates his property from his person the moment the contract begins, it is clear that the usurer demands remuneration for doing absolutely nothing, extorting from his victims what is not his to take. St. Thomas is in complete agreement. He who lends money transfers the ownership of the money to the borrower. Hence, the borrower holds the money at his own risk and is bound to pay it all back, wherefore the lender must not exact more. And if the usurer remains incorrigible and does exact more, Aquinas notes that the balance of justice will demand a restitution. Quote, "Just as a man is bound to restore other ill-gotten goods, so he is bound to restore the money which he has taken in usury." Of course, some modern economists and Catholic libertarians object to Aquinas' claim that the usurer charges rent for nothing. These critics have tried to justify usurious loans by suggesting that it is just for the lender to charge a rent for the opportunity cost lost by the alienation of his funds to the borrower. After all, had the lender not loaned the money to the borrower, it is possible that he could have invested the funds elsewhere and made a profit. Therefore, the loss of this potential investment opportunity must be remunerated. This initially seems plausible, but a more careful examination reveals the clever deception that is involved. The biggest problem with the opportunity cost defense of usury is that it confuses act and potential, something Aquinas understood quite well. A potential profit is not in fact the same thing as an actual profit. To monetize a potential profit as if it were an actual one would be to treat as real, tangible, alienable property that which is only a hypothetical and which cannot be alienated. No one among us would take seriously a student who treats the hypothetical possibility of a completed homework assignment the same as an actually completed one. The very fact that the student chooses not to do his homework negates the possibility of a completed assignment, the same way that a lender choosing to loan his money to a borrower negates the possibility of profit elsewhere as a real consideration. How can the lender continue to charge the borrower a rent for the possibilities negated as a result of his own free decision to loan him the funds? As Aquinas himself notes, the lender cannot enter an agreement for compensation through the fact that he makes no profit out of his money, because he must not sell that which he has not yet and may be prevented in many ways from having. Regardless of what the usurer may claim, his purely hypothetical sob story about the profits he could have made and the assets that could have been acquired is just that, a sob story, not a monetizable commodity, an excuse to sin. The second and last objection to Aquinas' synthesis comes from the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises in what he termed the time value of money. The argument goes as follows. When the usurer charges a rent on the funds which are no longer in his possession, he is in fact monetizing an actually existing preference in the borrower for ready money over the promise of future money. All things being equal, the Austrians claim that $1 today is more valuable than the promise of $1 tomorrow, or the promise of $1 a year from now, or the promise of $1 10 years from now. This initially seems plausible, but the premise upon which it is based is false, and a reflection of the unnatural and delusional presuppositions of modernity. If you believe, as economist John Maynard Keynes believed, that we're all dead in the long run, and that we should eat, drink, and be merry today, for tomorrow may not come, then yes, you probably would prefer $1 today over the promise of $1 tomorrow. However, preference does not determine reality, nor does it determine real value. Our delusions about the true nature of things does not affect their real ontological status. The fact is that in this fallen life, all things move in the direction of entropy and decay, and thus towards dissolution. The natural state of any given object in this life is towards its corruption and dissolution, not towards its proliferation and growth. To beat against the current requires strenuous labor and the grace of God. The promise of $1 tomorrow requires human effort and labor which is necessary to secure it against theft, flood, fire, and other present danger today. Labor is not free, and the efforts of the laborer must be compensated as a matter of justice. This means that, all things being equal, the promise of a title to a future asset is actually more valuable than the title to the same asset at present, for precisely the same reason people purchase insurances and take strenuous labors to protect existing assets to which they hold titles. Protecting things against chaos is difficult work. Thus, this makes the so-called time value of money a concession in favor of the borrower, not the lender, as the borrower is the one laboring to protect the value of the lender's asset into the future, not vice versa. Thus, the Austrians are hoisted by their own petard. By way of conclusion, if there is one thing that we must now see, it is that the system of usury is an economics of nihilism, for it is a radical misperception of the created order that God has bestowed upon us. In demanding something for nothing, it violates the natural imperative to work and labor for one's living by the sweat of one's brow. It is a mathematical fraud, a delusional ontology which seeks to monetize possibilities and treat them if they were present realities. Demanding certainty where none can be given, it is the presumption of this earth and the fruits of this earth, and a fist pointed at God. Do not be deceived. We know that there are those who say that the modern economic system could not survive without the existence of usury. To them we reply, so much the worse for the modern economic system. There is no progress to be made outside the moral order. We know all too well that in dealing with grave sin, whatever appears to be to our benefit can only lead to our further destruction. All of the unique horrors of the modern age call themselves usury's children. It is imperative that we begin again to make distinctions and to draw thin the line. There is no hope for us otherwise. Should we choose not to condemn usury, we must pay the abortionists and the sodomites our regards, for the future will be theirs.